Thank you, thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be part of this series. First time I came to Kansas City was 3 months into my new job as a political writer. I was 28 years old for the old National Observer, a weekly newspaper, published by Dow Jones, long since departed from the scene. And it was the 1974 midterm Democratic convention. 2 years later, of course, I came back for the Republican convention, which was the last convention in which the outcome was unknown at the beginning. I couldn't be more pleased to be here and to be part of this series. I've heard a bit about the previous incarnations of the series, and I'm told by someone that I'm the cleanup hitter. Now, somebody out here in the audience I was talking to earlier made a comment. I would never say this myself. That's maybe good because you haven't had a cleanup hitter in this town for some time. As I say, I would never say that. But I do feel that I'm qualified for this assignment because I love Harry Truman, as you will see. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how this book came about, and then that'll get into the whole question of presidents, and it isn't really a question of how we rate them or rank them, although that's the entry point. It's really a question about how we use our assessment of presidents to help us understand how the presidency works, how this marvelous institution of our nation has come into being and how it has operated over the course of our history. The idea for the book began with a phone call I got in early 2010 from a guy by the name of Mark Lotto, who at that time was an editor on the op-ed page of the New York Times, and he wanted to know if I wanted to write a piece for them about a comment that President Obama, then about a year into his presidency, had made to Diane Sawyer. He was being interviewed by Diane Sawyer on ABC News, and she had been apparently chiding him a bit on the unpopularity of some of his proposals and programs, and he responded, one could say perhaps a bit defensively, in saying that, quote, I would rather be a really good one-term president than a mediocre two-term president. And Lotto wanted to know, would I be interested in writing a piece about perhaps really good one-term presidents? And he mentioned particularly William Howard Taft as a one-term president whose presidency was cut short by the sort of intervention within the party of Teddy Roosevelt. And I told him that I would very much like to write a piece about that, but I was more interested in comparing history's judgment with the contemporaneous judgment of the electorate, because it occurred to me that what Obama was saying was that he was willing to accept unpopularity with his programs, even to the point of voter rejection, in favor of the esteem of history. And the question I wanted to ask was, how realistic is this? How feasible is this? Does this really happen in American politics? And so I wanted to compare history's judgment, and how do we assign history's judgment? Well, it really is the polls, the surveys of historians and academics that are conducted every few years, every 8-7 years, by somebody in academia, since Arthur Schlesinger Sr. began this process in 1948, thus setting in motion a kind of conversation about our presidents and how they performed and how we rate them or rank them. And compare that with the contemporaneous judgment of the electorate, as reflected in such questions as, was the president reelected? If he was reelected, was his party retained in power after his second term? What about midterm elections? What was the fate of the party in power in those? And what I came to the conclusion of was that there is a large correlation between the assessment of history, as reflected in those surveys, and the assessment of the voters. In other words, seldom has history hailed a president rejected by the voters, and vice versa. But the question posed by Obama, once again to put it just a little bit differently, can he set himself above the electorate with unpopular programs to such an extent that he gets tossed out by the electorate and still get high praise from the historians? The record indicates almost no chance. So it was kind of a false dichotomy, if you will, between political popularity and governmental success. So I can't help noting in passing that I observed President Obama during the late campaign, and he didn't give me the impression of a president who was willing to accept a one term on any basis whatsoever. But here's the sort of interesting thing about this little construction that I've put forward, and that is that there are exceptions to this correlation. And I became sort of intrigued by those as kind of an exercise in political analysis. And so that's when I kind of thought, well, I wrote the piece for Mark Lotto in the New York Times, and it appeared in 2010, right around President's Day. And then it occurred to me that maybe I could expand this into using this as a kind of leverage point to get into the question of how the presidency works, how presidents fail and succeed, and how we assess their performance over time. It's the White House rating game, as I say in the book. And as I say in the book, let's play it. Now, Mark Twain once said, it's difference of opinion that make horse races. And I've quoted that a lot. But the thing is about horse races, the difference of opinion comes to an end at the finish line. In the Great House rating game, there's no finish line. This just goes on forever, which is good for people like me who want to write books on topics such as this. So what's the judgment of history? I sort of pulled together 7 polls or surveys, including somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 academics over the course of several decades. And to me, that's a repository of judgment that is worthy of respect. And then, of course, the judgment of the electorate. So let's talk about some of the disparities and some of the examples in which the voters liked the guy, but history was negative. Grant, Harding, Coolidge, and initially Eisenhower, from not too far away from here, of course, and Reagan. And presidents that history likes, but the voters were negative. Wilson, Cleveland, John Adams, and one could say Truman. Truman? Well, I'm going to get to that, because Truman's a really interesting case study in all of this. But to begin with, let's just make sure that everyone understands that all of the surveys, all the historical polls, consistently identify 9 greats or near greats. And they are, the consensus of the polls is Lincoln, Washington, and FDR, almost always in that order, followed in various rank order by Jefferson, Jackson, Polk, my guy, Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, who was not succeeded by his own party, but was a 2-term president, and Truman, who served 2 terms, an inherited term, and a term in which he was elected in his own right, and not succeeded by his own party. All the rest of these guys were 2-term presidents succeeded by their own party, except for Polk, who was the exception that kind of tests the rule, because he's the only president in our history who ran on a promise not to seek re-election if elected. So all 8 who sought re-election got re-elected, and all but 2 were succeeded by their own party, which, as I say, is the highest electoral accolade that the voters can bestow upon a president. So history and the electorate are largely in sync when we're talking about the greatest of the great, the men that many of these I call men of destiny. Now let's look at those who were judged by history to be presidential failures. Buchanan, who was Polk's Secretary of State and proved himself to be a man of very limited character. Franklin Pierce, who was an alcoholic. Andrew Johnson, Millard Fillmore, and Warren G. Harding, and now increasingly Nixon is put in there. Not a 2-term president in the bunch. But there's one interesting 2-term outlier, and that's Ulysses S. Grant, who in the early polls was consistently considered to be a failure. So he was a 2-term president, and so let's go to Grant for a second and see if we can't understand how a 2-term president, in which the voters elected him twice, he was succeeded by his own party, and that's an interesting story in itself, would be considered a failure. Now, there was some pretty serious financial chicanery that took place in his administration in his second term. And the fact that he was a two-term president is attributable to the reality that that election of 1876 was in true reality a stolen election having to do with Reconstruction and controlling of electoral votes in some southern states that were under occupation. So there was, in fact, a corrupt manipulation of the vote, which was settled through a kind of backroom deal whereby the political people in power suggested that they would go ahead and give the White House to the Republican Party if the Republican Party, in the person of Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, would end Reconstruction as it had been carried out up to that time, which he then did. So that's a kind of a little bit of a nasty element to this whole thing regarding Polk. But if you look at his first term, it was a clear success. You can't argue really that this was not a successful term. It was characterized by a frothy economic boom, which was led by railroad construction, hence the voters had no particular reason to toss him out. Now, his second term was a different proposition. It was characterized by some nasty financial scandals, as I mentioned, involving White House officials and cabinet officials. Grant didn't handle it very well. He really stood up for some of these people when he should have been cutting himself loose from them. And a rather significant economic downturn. So the second term was significantly less successful, and the Republicans should have lost after that term. But taken together, I wouldn't put him in a failure category, and here we get where history and the American people, the contemporaneous judgment of the electorate just don't come together, which raises a point. Historians and the voters judge presidents totally differently. And here's where we're going to come to our guy, Harry S. Truman. Historians look at a president based on his entire record, however long he was in the White House, and what he accomplished during that time. That's what they're designed to do. That's what their role is. The American people assess presidents based upon how the Constitution and the Founding Fathers invited them to assess them in 4-year increments. They have hiring and firing authority over these people, and they take it very seriously. And so they look at these presidents in terms of what they accomplished or what they didn't accomplish in those 4 years. And my favorite example, as I say, is Harry S. Truman, who, as I say, you gotta love that guy. Now, history has always considered him in the near great category. The first poll after his election, he was categorized in the near great category, even though the voters had become totally disenchanted with the man, one could say tired of him. His Gallup poll rating in his last year of the full year of the presidency was 22%. It almost can't get any lower than that. I mean, there's got to be at least 22% of Americans who are going to be favorable towards any president. So how do you square this? Well, history is looking at his overall record, and the overall record is heroic. There's the agonizing decision to drop the atomic bomb twice on Japan, thus saving probably 1 million lives. That had to be one of the most tough decisions any president has ever made in history. There was the very successful transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy, very difficult and yet handled smoothly. There was America's role in fostering the UN and the Bretton Woods Agreement, creating both a geopolitical international organization and an international financial organizations. There was the containment policy, which saved Western Europe. I don't think there's any question about that, including the Marshall Plan, the National Security Act of 1947 that created the Defense Department and the CIA. There was the Berlin airlift, which was a heroic decision and very, very difficult. All of his advisors said he should not do it because Berlin was lost, and he refused to buy that, and he saved Berlin. And as I say, all this is basically heroic. The second term, I have to say, and I hope you'll permit me to say so, was mediocre at best. He had some notable achievements. I'd say NATO and the Incheon landing in the Korean War, which totally transformed the sort of the balance of power in that war. But it was characterized, that term, by a sputtering economy through much of that time, a stalemated war in Korea. That's a poison for any sitting president, to be involved in a war that he can't get out of, can't win, and can't control. There was a series of sort of petty scandals involving some of his pals from around here, actually, who probably were placed in positions that they were not entirely qualified for. And so the voters in the Democratic Party signaled to Harry Truman, as his second term was coming to an end, that he probably ought not to seek the Democratic nomination for a full term, for a second full term. And then the Democrats were tossed out by the voters at the next election when Eisenhower was elected in 1952. So in my view, the history and the voters both had it right. He deserves to be up there where he was, and yet the voters were correct in assessing his second term performance as being essentially subpar. So we're kind of on a roll here, so let's keep going on, get some more of these guys. Let's talk about John Adams and Grover Cleveland. Because the first academic poll, the Arthur Schlesinger Senior Poll in '48, has Grover Cleveland ranked 8th and John Adams ranked 9th. Now Cleveland, we don't know much about Cleveland. I mean, I didn't before I started this project, and American people, I think, generally don't. They know two things about him. They know that he's from New York, and they know that he's the only president who served 2 non-consecutive terms. What they're less aware of is that his party lost the White House after each of those terms. The first time with him on the ballot, he actually won in the popular vote for when he went up for re-election, but he lost in the Electoral College. And the second time, after his party had basically rejected him, he wanted to be on the ballot, but the party rejected him, and William Jennings Bryan was put on the ballot, and he lost to William McKinley. So the result of this is that Grover Cleveland, ranked 8th in that first poll, it has the distinction of being our country's only 2-time, 1-term president. So how do you get to 8th? I don't quite understand that. Well, perhaps it's related to the fact that Alan Nevins, who's a great historian and was revered during his lifetime, especially by his peers, had written a 2-volume biography of Grover Cleveland, in which he called Grover Cleveland, A Study in Courage. It was a very hagiographic biography. He apparently loved the guy. 2 volumes is a lot on Grover Cleveland, in my view, and I have to say, my next project is 1890s, and I'm going to be focusing on William McKinley and the Spanish-American War, and Teddy Roosevelt, and William Lodge, and a lot of other people. And I'm going to have to read these 2 volumes, and I don't know if I'm looking forward to it, to be quite honest with you. But Alan Nevins is a wonderful, beautiful writer, so I'm sure it'll probably be good. But in any event, there's a kind of a mismatch that is kind of baffling to me. So let's look at his presidency real quickly. His first term was decent, not exemplary, I would say. Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act going after the Railroad Trust, but he didn't really identify himself with it in any particular way. He signed it. There was solid economic growth during that time, and he curbed significant abuses that had emerged in the Civil War pension and disability program. But there was extensive labor unrest, significant loss of life in demonstrations and street unrest, and that is, and a lot of property damage, and that's a real bad situation for any sitting president. And he failed to reduce tariffs, which is what Democrats were supposed to do. His second term was a clear failure. Persistent economic downturn, extensive bank failures, corporate bankruptcies, devastation in the farm sectors. So I would say overall, he was middling at best, and the voters had it right. So if you're seeing a theme here, that I think that the voters probably have greater judgment when there's a distinction to be made between the voters and the historians, I tend to go with the voters. And if you look at the performance of these guys, it tends to make sense. So John Adams, clearly a great man, a great patriot, and a great contributor to our nation's birth. And everyone knows that, I think, largely because of David McCullough's magisterial book and the wonderful HBO series, a mini-series on his life that was produced afterward. I wish they'd do more of that sort of thing. But he was not a great president. He was not a near great president. certainly doesn't deserve to be ranked ninth. He presided over significant French abuse of U.S. commercial shipping, which he didn't seem to be able to know what to do about. He signed and kind of fostered the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is, I think, one of the most nefarious pieces of legislation ever passed in our nation's history, which criminalized public criticism of the government and the Sedition Act was used to sort of root out French immigrants who were considered potentially hostile to the Federalist sensibilities that were fostered and promoted by John Adams. There's a story of one obscure, simple, quiet bookstore owner in Philadelphia who was singled out for deportation under the Sedition Act. And he didn't understand why him. He had a friend who had some connections in the government, so he said, can you find out why are they coming after me? So he made some inquiries, and he came back and reported that his friends had told him that the president, when he was asked about this, said, well, nothing in particular, but he's just too French. He attempted to get the country prepared for the war that he was trying to avoid, which is not a bad thing to do. But in doing that, he fostered massive tax increases, which brought the economy down. And so the voters in 1800 sent him packing and put Thomas Jefferson in there. And I have to say, I think the voters had it about right, and the historians are a bit off the mark on this one. Now, both Cleveland and Adams have seen their rankings decline since the 1948 poll, but both of them are still ranked rather highly. So let's go now to the other side of the coin, a man who is considered to be, gets no respect in history. He's laughed at, he's ridiculed. As Mayor Daley once said, I've been vilified, I've been crucified, I've even been criticized. And that's the fate of Warren G. Harding, who is considered a total failure by the historians, ranked dead last in most of the polls until relatively recently. Recall he was elected in 1920. He died in office. It has to be said he was a passive chief executive. He didn't have an agenda of any particular significance except peace, prosperity, and domestic tranquility. He's generally viewed as a kind of a vacuous suit of clothes whose career was fueled by the fact that he looked almost precisely like what people at that time thought a president should look like. And people would shake their heads at his 15-year affair with a married woman named Carrie Phillips, whose husband happened to be his closest friend during that entire time. They snicker at the sort of vision of a sexual tryst that he had in a White House coat closet with a starry-eyed young woman, 31 years his junior, by the name of Nan Britton. And he's dismissed as kind of weak, inert. He let Congress set the national agenda, and finally, the coup de grace on his reputation, the Teapot Dome scandal, which broke big time after he died in office on a trip to the West. He died in San Francisco. And still, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said that he was probably, quote, more careless than villainous, meaning he was overly protective of some of the people that he shouldn't have had in office. And Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who always seemed to have a way of putting things into perspective, said, Harding wasn't really a bad man. He was just a slob. But let me make a point here. He was never implicated in any scandal himself. In fact, he was a small-time newspaper owner in Ohio. He had a small newspaper there. He never, as far as anyone knew or knows, he never leveraged his governmental position to help his little business in Ohio, unlike, say, for example, Lyndon Johnson, who had his rich friends get him into the television business under his wife's name where he could become a millionaire while he was serving the country. Nothing bad happened to the country during his tenure. There were no intractable wars he got us into. He got the country through Wilson's economic depression, which was a very serious economic downturn that was very threatening, and yet he got us out of that very, very quickly and presided over a very robust economy, including a GDP growth rate in 1922 of nearly 14%. I would have to say that Barack Obama could have used a couple of percentage points of that 14% in the last campaign. And social unrest, which had been really getting very serious under Wilson during his last years in office, was brought under control. So you could say that Warren Harding was elected to nullify Wilsonism, and he pretty much fulfilled that mandate, which is not a bad record. And yet, there he is down there in the bottom. So now we come to Woodrow Wilson. It's probably my favorite subject, and I don't like the guy. I don't like him in part because he was a sanctimonious sort of a fellow. And I don't think that sanctimony is a very good trait for presidents. The presidents we've had who had serious sanctimony about them were John Quincy Adams, James K. Polk, Jimmy Carter, and I think perhaps you could put and Wilson, of course, and I think you could put George W. Bush into that category. And they all had serious problems governing the country as a result of that particular trait, in my view. So Wilson's first term was a clear success, but I would say of modest proportions, but clearly deserved re-election in our presidential referendum politics. He reduced tariffs, which is what Democrats did, and often it led to a robust economic upswing. He brought about banking reform, created the Federal Reserve, which was a necessary thing. The country was struggling with how to basically maintain currency stability and have a repository for federal monies. He brought about the Clinton Antitrust Act, Anti-Monopoly Act, which was probably necessary. He overcame, his policies brought about some economic difficulties during his first term, but he turned it around before the election, which is always a smart thing to do. And, main thing, he kept us out of war, which is the slogan that he ran on. And then, upon re-election, he promptly maneuvered the country into war by manipulating the neutrality issue in ways that favored Britain. And America and his Secretary of State, John Quincy, William James Bryan, told him, "You're going to get in a war if you pursue these policies," and he wouldn't listen. And William Jennings Bryan resigned over the issue, and sure enough, he did get us into a war. And then he immediately used all the power at his disposal, and power that probably shouldn't have been at his disposal, to transform American society overnight in ways that ended up being very deleterious. Telegraph, telephone, and railroads were nationalized. He instituted military draft, which you have to do in a war like that. Taxes surged dramatically from 7% top rate on income taxes to 70%. The economy flipped out of control. The GDP was down 5% in one year, then 6% the next. There was a significant suppression of dissent under the Attorney General Palmer, who became infamous. There were urban riots in the North and the Midwest. And the war never yielded what he promised that it would. So by 1920, the American people were basically saying, we got to get this guy or this party out of here, and that's how we got Warren G. Harding. And yet, historians consistently have him in the great or near great category, and even though the voters ended up being very negative. And in my own view is that the voters, once again, were closer to the mark. But let's talk about when voters and historians converge. And they converge on what we might call the greatest of the great. There's a group of presidents that I call leaders of destiny. They are the presidents who really transformed American society and moved it in a new direction. So what are the criteria for the leaders of destiny? Well, one, they have to have, by my definition, I just have three criteria that sort of puts them in that category. One, consistently high ranking in historians' polls. In other words, historians have a consensus that they're right up there, great, or near great. Second, 2 terms succeeded by their own party. In other words, the voters agree with that assessment at the time. And third, they transformed the country's political landscape and set it upon a new course. Now, this is very difficult to do. Not many presidents, even just having a 2-term presidency succeeded by your own party, it's not happened very often. In our history, there have been 8 presidents who have been elected twice, succeeded by their own party. If you include partial terms, which you have to do, Teddy Roosevelt, for example, or Abraham Lincoln, who served a partial term, and succeeded by their own party. There are 12 out of the 44. So that's not very easy. In the 20th century, presidents who were elected twice and succeeded by their own party, only two: Franklin D. Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. So who are these guys? Well, the suspense is killing me, so let's get to it right now. Here. And in my definition, they're Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, TR, and FDR. And so let's talk about each of them in turn very, very briefly. Washington set it all in motion, and he set it all in motion so brilliantly with deft and very judicious decision-making. And then he relinquished power at the appropriate time. You go back and look at his presidency. There's been a lot written recently, in the last decade or so, about Washington, and I think that the reverence that the country has for what he did in setting this in motion, because even small missteps in those 8 years of his presidency could have had big, significant impact down the road as the country was veering in a direction that could have been deleterious. And then Jefferson, he obliterated the effort on the part of certain Federalists of Washington's party to craft something approaching an American aristocracy, totally opposed to that. And he established the small government ethos of American politics, which is still a significant strain that runs through our politics, and I think appropriately so, as a significant political sensibility. And then Jackson, he fostered the mass electorate. A lot things were happening in America in terms of expanding the franchise and allowing more people to vote. Bearing in mind that there were a lot of people who couldn't vote, including all women and African Americans, et cetera. But nevertheless, the country was struggling with this question of the franchise and how we apply this democratic principle. And Jackson moved it very significantly towards the expansion as he saw and fostered states eliminating property requirements and opening up the vote and bringing the Electoral College closer and closer to the people. And so he essentially created the mass electorate by fostering that development. And then he galvanized it with a brand of politics, which I call conservative populism, same brand of politics I think that we got from Ronald Reagan, that has, again, ribboned its way through our politics. And he was a dominant political voice in American politics from 1925 to about 1949. And there are very few people in our history who have dominated political discourse for that length of time. And then Lincoln, and we all know he saved the Union and he freed the slaves. And he also turned the fledgling Republican Party into an agency of industrialization, which was very, very significant. He doesn't get a lot of credit for that. Reagan also probably is, I don't know if you've seen the movie Lincoln. I saw it the other day, and I think it's quite a masterpiece. I have a few nits to pick in terms of the way they portray this or that, but I think it's a true masterpiece in terms, especially in its characterization of how Lincoln thought and operated and acted. And a great president knows how, when I say he sets the course of the country on a new course, or he changes the political landscape, you do this through rhetoric, you do this through changing the way people think. When Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," it's hard for us to understand what a powerful statement that was. All of our politics up to that time was dominated by one of two things: people who were trying to tear the house down, mostly in like South Carolina and in Massachusetts, where the radicals on both sides were, or people who were trying to prop up that divided house. And Lincoln was the president who essentially said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," borrowing language from Scripture, which is always very powerful, especially in that day. And he knew that was going to basically lance the boil, as it were. The country, once it understood that, was going to have to settle this thing, which had been trying to avoid for 10 years and couldn't any longer. That's the substance of greatness. Teddy Roosevelt brought forth a political idiom that was concentrated on curbing the abuses of the industrial age. The industrial age had dominated American politics since the end of the Civil War, and rightly so. It was very, very powerful, but a lot of abuses inevitably became encrusted upon that system. And Teddy Roosevelt was the first president, unlike the guy I'm now studying, William McKinley, who didn't understand this, who stepped forward and said, no, we're going to have to fix some of these things. We're going to have to ameliorate these problems. And finally, Franklin Roosevelt, who saved, in my view, democratic capitalism from the ravages unloosed upon it by the agonies of the Great Depression, and transformed America first, and then he transformed the world. And that is quite an accomplishment. Now, what were the common attributes of these men of destiny? What did they all have? Well, first, I think it has to be said that not every president elected can be a man of destiny, because when I say that one of the definitional points about it is that he moves the country in a new direction, it isn't always the case that the American people want to move the country in a new direction. And if that's the case, then any president who wants to move them in a new direction is going to get crushed, or he's going to get sort of reminded. I think a good example of that would be Bill Clinton, whose first 2 years ended in a disastrous political assault by the voters, who essentially took the Congress away from him because they thought he was attempting to move the country in the wrong direction. He said one of his aims was to repeal Reaganism. Well, the American people had voted for Reagan twice and voted for his successor. And they weren't really pleased to hear a president step forward and say he's going to repeal what they had freely done just a few years earlier. It was insulting to them. And so they clipped his wings with the midterm election of 1994. And then he very carefully and brilliantly crafted a means of governing from the center left that was very much in keeping with what the American people had elected him to do. So, number one, you have to understand your time. And if the country is desperate for a new direction, you've got to somehow figure out how to craft that new direction and move the country there. And if you can't, then you're not going to rise to that high level, and you very likely may not be reelected. A good example of a president who understood this is Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952, as you know, just 20 years after Roosevelt was elected. The country was very much still in the New Deal era, the Franklin Roosevelt era. And many, many Republicans felt that now that we have a Republican president, we're going to have to repeal the New Deal, or we're going to have to really chip away at it. We're going to have to really attack it. And Eisenhower, unlike Bill Clinton, understood that that would be a disaster, political disaster for him, because the country was not prepared for that. And so what he did instead was he tried to sand down some of the rough edges, to sort of nudge the country in some directions, but while maintaining an understanding of the New Deal as the sort of governing ethos of the time. So getting back to these men of destiny, and what are these three attributes, I will say that vampire hunting is not one of them. De Gaulle once said that a statesman may be determined and tenacious, but if he does not understand the character of his time, he will fail. So that's number one, and that gets back to the Eisenhower-Clinton dichotomy that I just discussed. You need to understand what the country is hungry for, what it wants, and then you have to be able to deliver that. So that, secondly, he must have vision. And that's the capacity to visualize the new direction for America, or how he is going to enhance Americans' lives within the same direction, and bring about a seriously changed country. And third, and this is a kind of a vague, complex quality. I call it political adroitness. It's really the ability to get your hands on the levers of power in our system so that you can move the country in the direction you want to move it in, and that's not very easy. Our system does not give presidents a lot of easy means of doing that. In fact, it puts a lot of impediments in their way, and so the ability to do that is paramount, to sort of harness the swirling political forces and direct them successfully towards this vision that he also has to have. So all 6 of these guys had it, and here I'm going to venture into a kind of a controversial little area here, because I'm going to say, it's getting back to my 3 criteria, the consistently high marks by the historians, 2 terms succeeded by their own party, and transform the political landscape and set the country on a new course. And I'm going to bring up in that context Ronald Reagan. Now, I was really struck what we heard earlier about what Diggins said about Reagan. I wasn't really aware of that, and it's a very, very funny construct, which I don't think I agree with entirely. But Reagan has 2 of those 3, because he was a 2-term president succeeded by his own party. He did, I think it has to be said, that he did set the country on a new course. He changed the political landscape. He really transformed the political debate regarding domestic economic policy, and reintroduced economic growth as a fundamental, which had been languishing in political discourse. And then he altered the political landscape, the geopolitical landscape, with how he handled the Cold War challenge that he faced when he was elected in 1980. So I think that ultimately the historians will bring him into that 3rd category as well, and he seems to be moving in that direction. Eisenhower is an interesting case in point. When Eisenhower, the first poll that came out after Eisenhower's presidency was 1962, and he was really in middling territory. He was down there with Chet Arthur, who inherited the presidency at the death of his predecessor, and didn't run for a 2nd term. And I think maybe Andrew Johnson, Chet Arthur and Andrew Johnson are sort of on above and below him. And that was an insult. And I think that Republicans at the time in 1962 felt that these academics were biased, and they probably were. But over time, history stepped back, and the political passions of the moment dissipated, and a more dispassionate analysis ensued, and he rose up, and now he's consistently close to the near great category, ranked somewhere between 9th and 14th, which I think is probably about right. So I think that same thing is probably happening to Reagan, and so we may see that he's going to be rising in history's estimation. So the book also talks about what I call the split decision presidents, the presidents who were 2 terms but not succeeded by their own party, and how that works. The war presidents, the war decision is the most politically dangerous decision that any president can make, because it can turn sour very, very rapidly if the war doesn't go well. The abject failures. And then the more recent presidents, who I consider to be too soon. It's not fair, really, to try to give a historical perspective. But after all, I'm a journalist as well as a historian, so I felt perfectly free to make my assessment of where I thought the American people were with regard to these people, and therefore what history may say about them down the road. And the underlying theme is very simple: that this is an amazing institution, and the power emanates from the people who own the office, which is why it's an amazing institution. And this invests the office with considerable political force. But there's, as I was saying before, getting ahead of myself there at that point, there's always these multiple curtailments. He speaks for all the people, but he must deal with many, many other politicians who speak persistently for smaller constituency. And the result is that it's very difficult to be successful. And to sort of make this point and to close out this part of the conversation, I'll quote 2 presidents, Wilson and your guy, Truman. Wilson once said, If a president rightly interpret the national thought and boldly insist upon it, he is irresistible. And that's true. But Truman once, when he was president, went up to see his pals up on the hill where he liked to hang out at the Board of Education meetings up there with Sam Rayburn and the gang. And one time he had a particularly bad day, and he stared into his bourbon and branch, and he growled, "They talk about the power of the presidency, how I can just push a button and get things done. Why, I spend most of my time kissing somebody's ass." And that's just about it. That's about what it takes. So thank you so very much.